This conversation on the encyclical is not a one and done kind of thing. Just the other day, a subcommittee of the parish council wants to explore ways that we can keep the encyclical in front of us throughout the year, taking advantage of opportunities to continue the teaching of this encyclical. So what are we going to do this morning? I would like to give just a brief overview of what is an encyclical and why it matters. A little bit about Pope Francis and the synergy that surrounds him and this document. And then I'd like to do a brief overview. The encyclical is 6 chapters, the first, second, and third chapter. Then I want us to have some conversation together. And then we'll look at chapters 4, 5, and 6. Again, there'll be some time for conversation and concluding remarks. By then it'll be midnight, and then we're going to go to Pat Connery's house. She's doing a leg roast, a free-range organic lamb. You're going to love it. So, okay, we'll get started. Okay, a little bit about an encyclical. An encyclical is a papal letter, and the tradition for many hundred years is the encyclical has been a way for the Pope to exercise his teaching office. The encyclical is one of the highest forms of papal teaching, just short of infallibility statements, which require a whole process. Encyclicals cover anything that has to do with what the Pope wants to address. And popes have used encyclicals to address the celebration of the Mass, the training of priests, the role of the laity in the church, economic issues, labor issues, the study of sacred scripture. Laudato Si is in the body of doctrine of social teachings, social encyclicals. And there have been 10 social encyclicals, and the first one was issued in 1891 by Pope Leo. A very significant statement, Rerum Novarum. It was right at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and the Pope was expressing his deep concern for the dignity of the human person as this industrial technology was reducing human beings to kind of spokes in a wheel. And so several of the encyclicals have had to deal with labor, the worker, the right of workers to organize, the moral responsibility of employers to have their workers get a just wage and live and work in safe conditions. A second category of social encyclicals were sort of initiated by John the 23rd's famous document, Pacem in Terris, and this moves social teaching into the relationship of people and nations, the confrontation of war, the yearning of the Holy Fathers that we would resist the temptation of jumping so quickly into war and to explore nonviolent resolutions to our conflicts. Now, some are saying that this encyclical may be breaking ground for a whole new arena, which is the war on creation, that we are dangerously threatening the very future of our planet with some of the conditions that are present in the world today. And so there are some very interesting things that make this a very unique encyclical. The first is just the interest that it has galvanized. Papal encyclicals are always the best kept secret in Rome. And generally some unconfirmed, high-ranking Vatican official will say, the Pope is writing an encyclical, which means in 2 days the encyclical is issued. And typically is sent directly to bishops, because the Pope is a teacher, the bishops are teachers. This encyclical is issued to the people of the world, to everybody. There has never been a document like this, and he's very sensitive to non-believers, to non-Christians. We're all in this common home, the earth, whatever our religious identity might be. This is the first encyclical that is gender sensitive in its language. And if you look at encyclicals, whenever the Pope is addressing, people, it's always men. And in this encyclical, there's a tremendous effort remarkable by Vatican standards to be very sensitive to the language regarding people. This is the first encyclical that doesn't have a Latin title. Everybody thinks Laudato Si is a Latin term. It's actually Italian, and it's ancient Italian. This is Italian that was spoken around the 5th and 6th century. This would have been the language of St. Francis of Assisi. This was the language that the Canticle of the Sun was written in. The encyclicals always take the first 2 or 3 words of the opening of the encyclical as the title. So these first couple of words are taken from Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Sun. The Pope bases the whole theology on this sacred relationship with creation. Blessed be, Sister Sun and Brother Moon, and using these familial titles to the world that we live in. Very much a part of Francis's vision. One of the things that scholars do is they're more interested in the footnotes than they are in the actual text. And the footnotes reveal a lot in this document. There are more than half of the footnotes refer to previous teachings of Paul VI, John the 23rd, Pope John Paul II, and Benedict. And some of the critiques of the encyclical is, where did Pope Francis come up with this idea of talking about the environment? Why doesn't he stick to saving souls? Or how does this fit into anything? This profound reference is a whole thing about continuity. While this is the first encyclical on the environment, all the popes have spoken in recent times about their concerns about the world. And so this is building on the teachings of his predecessors. It's not coming out of the dark, falling out of a tree, something very disconnected. Never has there been an encyclical that has so many references to secular wisdom. So there are many quotations of famous scientists, philosophers, cultural people. Remarkable that their input would make its way to a papal document of this significance. The Pope makes references to 16 Episcopal conferences of bishops. Most of these are bishops from the developing world. Now, for church watchers, this is very significant because John Paul and Pope Benedict were very determined to centralize the teaching authority of the church in Rome. And they did not like bishop conferences issuing apostolic letters. They felt that it was confusing people. And so these bishops would say, it was easier to write the letter than it was to get the Vatican to approve the letter. And by the Pope's reference to so many of these local churches, he's given credence to their wisdom. A bishop in Argentina or Brazil can speak about the reality of reckless waste in ways that someone in Rome can't. And so this is a great recognition of the College of Bishops and the importance of the local churches in this discussion. Another interesting thing is he does make several references to other communities of faith. It's a very ecumenical dialogue, and it's part of the Pope's thing. We're all in this together. Doesn't make a difference who you are. Striking are the number of references he makes to the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. He is the titular head of the Orthodox Church, and he's called the Green Patriarch. He's written extensively on environmental issues, and this is, again, unprecedented that the pontiff of the Roman Church would give such authority and mutual respect to the Orthodox Patriarch. And just as a side, I got a call the other day from the pastor of St. Peter and Paul. They're having an evening on August the 31st on the encyclical, and they would love for us to come. And this is, again, just wonderful ecumenical moment for us. September 1st is a holy day in the Orthodox Church on the preservation of the earth, which is why this talk and Vespers will be the night before. St. Peter and Paul has gone through, if you know anything, they've had a very difficult couple years over there, so this is a great opportunity for us to celebrate with them. Now we have Pope Francis, who's in the 3rd year of his pontificate. There's this kind of awareness that if 3 years ago you would have said that, one of the most popular people on the planet is the Pope, people would say, whatever you're on, stay on it. The church, it just was in a very difficult place. And not that everything has been resolved, but the Pope has aggressively sought to address a lot of issues, both internally and externally. But one of his missions is to go to the periphery, to the margins. Not just to bring the margins closer to the center, but to listen to the experience of people who live in the margins of culture, society. They have their story to tell, and nobody is listening to them. And so he is very concerned that it is the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the very poor that are suffering the brunt of the ecological condition of the earth right now, and that we have to include them in any resolution. The Pope is the first Pope that was not born in Europe and in modern times. And so he just brings a whole different perspective. He wasn't educated in Rome. He has spent much of his life as a bishop with the very, very poor. So he does look at things different. And the Pope will talk about this difference of the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere. And again, we're not talking to each other. And so people in the northern hemisphere have a great difficulty understanding the consequences of the rapid deterioration of the southern hemisphere's natural resources and the enslavement of people that we need to be better informed about. I suspect he's the only pope that has had a master's degree in chemistry. That just doesn't, he and Father Carci should form a team of having very unusual backgrounds for someone to be a pope. Now, John Paul and Pope Benedict write in very broad ideological manners, I think one of the most beautiful writers actually is Pope Benedict. If you've read his encyclicals, they are masterpieces. Pope Francis' style is the facts. I want the facts. I don't want to get caught in rhetoric. I want the facts. So his arguments are all backed up with facts. Again, encyclicals aren't written that way. This one is. And so he makes a case. You can say, you may disagree or agree, but the fact of the matter is he's a very fact-centered thinker, and he's very impatient with a lot of rhetoric and diatribes. This is what's happening. Whether you can accept it or not, this is what's happening from his perspective. So it's a different style. The style of the encyclical is a very readable style. You'd almost think it was written by a journalist. Encyclicals can often be experienced like a doctoral thesis. They're very heady. You get lost after the first, what is the point? He is not that kind of a writer, which doesn't mean that he doesn't deal with things in detail. One of the things, too, is this is a very frustrating thing about an encyclical, is we live in this soundbite talking point culture. So now the encyclical is 120 pages, and if you're like me, I've been watching everything on television, and so you'll hear people say, is the Pope channeling Al Gore? What? It's 120 pages about climate control. What gives him the authority to talk about climate control? It's just another effort of the Pope to bash capitalism. These are simplistic generalizations of a very complex document. It's not, to say it's all about climate control is to mean you haven't read it. Or as someone said to me, why isn't he worrying about the saving of souls? Well, if we don't get our act together, there won't be any souls to save. He's desperately an advocate of the most marginal and poor in our society. And so he's calling us to urgent action as a community, a human community, everybody. The other thing that's just very unusual about this document is that it's so sensitive to non-believers. And he really wants to engage everybody in the conversation. So he doesn't want to dismiss people who are of different faiths. And so even in the preparation of this document, he included some of the top scientists, some of them are non-believers. He included some of the most prominent Orthodox theologians. He listened to a wide variety of people, again, very unusual for a papal document. So let's get into it. Laudato Si, the care of our common home. This first chapter the Pope does a survey of the condition of the world that we live in as he sees it. And he identifies some of the major threats to our planet, some of the enormous challenges that we as a human community better get a handle on before we suffer unbelievable consequences. In many ways, we're already suffering from many of the consequences. You know, he has this very poignant phrase in the first chapter: the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. That's a pretty clear statement. Some of this, again, can be seen maybe as overstatement by the northern mind. You know, we've seen pollution, we've seen evidence of many of the things he's mentioning. Go to Rio de Janeiro, go to Buenos Aires, go to Calcutta, go to Beijing, go to Cairo, and just see the incredible, breathtaking, stunning poverty. You know, the Pope, when he was the head of the Jesuits, was part of the charge that was very much against liberation theology, which had become very politicized, and he was very tough on some of his colleagues that got involved. When he became the Bishop of Buenos Aires and started visiting the slum villages, he was completely transformed as a person. This is not empty rhetoric. The stunning number of people that live in cardboard boxes, the millions of people that go to bed hungry, malnourished, the disease that is rampant in these cities, this cloud of smog that is choking over these cities is just unbelievable from his perspective. So when he's talking, he uses the word filth. That's very deliberate. He's living in what is life surrounded by junk and waste. One of the evocative themes is climate change. You know, we know in our own country it's a political buzzword. Can get very caught in many layers of what do you mean by climate change. The Pope accepts the science of climate change. It's very clear in the document. Now, some have pushed that to say he has said that the science is settled. Well, he never says that. And, you know, as a scientist, science is never settled. It's a process constantly in motion. But as he describes the effects as he is seeing it, and his reading about it, and hearing experts talk about it, the rising sea levels, the melting of the polar ice caps, the temperature and fierce storms plaguing many parts of the planet, the sea levels that are rising and pose a tremendous threat to many parts of the world. This is happening, and he accepts the fact that when you talk about climate change, that human activity is contributing to climate change. There are many factors that can contribute to climate change, but he accepts the fact that human activity is making it worse and that it needs significant study and cooperation. He spends an enormous time on the issue of water, access to fresh, clean water. Now, this is again a northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere line of demarcation. We just are so used to turning the faucet on. Safe, clean water. The vast majority of the developing world, that is not their experience. You might spend all day trying to get safe, clean drinking water. And he's deeply concerned about the reckless pollution of the water supplies all around the world. And he's convinced that if we don't get a handle on this, this is going to lead to wars. There's going to be wars over access to water. I remember reading recently, a scientist was asked, where do you think would be the best place to live? And he said, on the shores of Lake Michigan, because we have one of the largest bodies of fresh water. And if you live in Phoenix, Arizona, you live in Southern California, you live in other parts of the world, it wouldn't take much for there to be a tremendous panic because of water. And the Pope believes because water is essential to life, it is a basic human right. He's afraid water is going to become privatized. You know, you'll have to buy it. The only people that can have water are people that can afford to purchase it. And that will lead, of course, to the genocide of the poor. So he said this is a stunning issue that we need to face. He's very concerned about the loss of biodiversity. You know, each day there are species going into extinction. animals that are displaced. They go to habitats that they can't adapt to. He's very concerned about the oceans. And we don't even know the species that are being extinct as the food chains get interrupted with the extinction of certain animals and other things. And so he's concerned about that. He's concerned about the decline of the quality of human life. You know, there's a tremendous movement around the world to cities. You know, everyone is moving to cities. You know, China has embarked on this incredible process of moving millions of people into cities. Some years ago, I was on a cruise in China, and we were going down, and the guide said, "Oh, that's the city is Xinjiang. It's a small city. There's only about 5 million people that live there." Well, I'm thinking Chicago is like, 6 million, you know, the metropolitan area. And here's a city that's a brand new city. It's about 5 years old. And it's all about this movement of people leaving the land and looking to cities. The cities have become, he said, disastrous. Parts of cities, vast parts of cities that are violent, unsafe. People live in concrete jungles. There's no green, there's no beauty to where they're living. Older people will talk about beautiful vistas that they once saw that are now garbage dumps. And that cities around the world are being strangled by overpopulation of just cramming people into very small dwelling places and not having the services to take care of them. He talks about this global inequality that exists in the world. And he challenges us to begin to get informed on the forces of inequality in our world. We all have very limited notions of what poverty is, what the causes of poverty. Some of our solutions to poverty actually make poverty worse. And it's because no one is talking. In this chapter, he concludes what he thinks, this is what to him, what is the greatest sin that he identifies in Laudato Si? The greatest sin facing the world is the sin of indifference. People don't care. People don't care. Societies don't care. Governments don't care. Business doesn't care. And some of this is geographical. It can be the northern hemisphere from the southern hemisphere. It can be within our own city. It can be in our own neighborhood. It's just a radical indifference about wanting to do anything to make a difference in the world. Everything is, I need this, or my quality of life has to be here, and I'm sorry, you're down over here. I want to stay up here. And so he challenges this terrible sin in the world of indifference. He then goes to the second chapter, which is the gospel of creation, completely different in tone from, you read the first chapter and it's like, oh my God, what are we going to do? I mean, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was this bad. It's a feeling you have. Then he gives, to me, one of the most beautiful presentations on a gospel of creation. He reminds us with such passionate language of how blessed we are with the earth. And he starts with the book of Genesis. God saw what he created, and what he created was good. We have this blessed gift, the earth. And as he reflects on creation, he talks about on the seventh day, God rested. And this kind of yearning that as human beings, we're losing a sense of rest. We don't know how to rest. We're all manic type A people running here, running there. Look at the schedule of a typical 8th grader. I'm not talking about the President of the United States, I'm talking about an 8th grader. What they're doing during the summer, which in my day was you get on a bike and you get lost for the day. They're go, 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 go. And we don't know how to rest. In the Jewish tradition, every 7th year, the earth was to rest. Farmers were not to farm their fields. You were to allow the earth to recover. There was a great sensibility. Whatever got produced off the land in and of its own, you could take. But there was a sense that nature needs to rest too, from this tremendous need to produce. And then in the Jewish tradition, on the seventh year cycle, the 49th, 50th year, was the year of the Great Jubilee. Everyone was to return to the land of their native home. That was the time when slaves were to be freed, debts forgiven. It was like starting over, a brand new birth. Even land. Land was seen as you're a temporary landlord, but God owns the land. You don't own the land. And so there was a time to reconcile that issue. And so the Pope hearkens us, and then he sees, of course, in Jesus the great inspiration of harmony with nature. He refers to those beautiful images in the gospel. Every bird of the air is counted. Every hair on your head is known by the Lord. God loves creation, every part of it. And we share in this great love of what God has given us. And it is a great challenge for us to embrace this reality. And then he goes into this fact that, I need to say we are not God. We think we're God. We think the world is for our disposal. God gave the world to us and do with it as you please. And that's often traced to that reference in Genesis where he says to Adam and Eve, take dominion of the earth and multiply. But we never continue the passage where he talks that you are to till and keep the land, that you are to work with the land, you are to be in relationship with the land. And this begins his thinking of the relationship. The earth existed before we existed. So Adam and Eve, the human person, came long after the world was created. And we need to see this as a gift given to us to be faithful stewards of, to be in relationship with all the creatures of the earth. Together we praise God, not just us, but together with everything in creation we praise the God of life. And so he pleads for this sense of mutual responsibility for the care of the earth and to resist the temptation that the earth is just an ATM machine that we can just keep taking as much as we want out of it. In chapter 3, the final chapter before we break for a building bit, is called The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis. And by this, he kind of explores this kind of idea that he refers to in this chapter 2 about the sense that we can do with the earth whatever we want. That the free markets ultimately will take care of everything. You don't have to worry. That the earth is made up of unlimited resources. There's no limits to what the earth can provide us. And so there's this, at times, reckless disregard. He knows from where he was at just the deforestation of the tropical forests, that is just having tremendous consequences as vast parts of the forests disappear and are creating all sorts of problems in the ecosystem. I was a psych major, and there was the great psychologist Adler, and he talked about the levels that we go for maturation and happiness. And one of the first thresholds that every one of us has to deal with is we are not the center of the universe. There's a startling awareness of an infant or a young toddler when all of a sudden that horrible lesson comes our way that the world was not created just to make me happy. Some of us have been unable to move to the next level, but there's this sense that everything is about me. And being the oldest, I almost killed my brother Michael because he interfered with my dominance of the family. The Pope makes a similar example with the human person, that we think the universe is all for us, that the earth is totally created to make our lives easier, that anything that we need is more important than the equilibrium of the environment, the ecology of the world that we live in. And so he talks about the process of rapidification, which is just the rapid change in life right now. We're moving so fast and we don't have a time to look at the implications or consequences of things. Things that seem so great, we find out later aren't so great. This whole thing about chemicals and preservatives in food was just fantastic, that food could have a much longer shelf life, Now we're finding out that these chemicals, long-term, have terrible consequences in terms of our health. So he calls for an awareness of slowing down and looking at what's happening to the world that we live in. He talks about the throwaway culture that we live in. And that we just, whether it's plastic, and he says, or whether it's people. It talks about trafficking, the exploitation of workers. There's like no stop to it in terms of what we need in the first world. And are we taking the time to look at the consequences and implications of what we're doing? He talks about materialism, and one of the things that just breaks his heart is that a third of the food that is produced in the world is thrown away. And we talk about portion control and things like this, but the stunning amount of the food produced is simply thrown away. And he says, it's taking the food off the table of the poorest in the world. They would give anything for the food that we throw out. How are we managing the distribution of food? How are we conscious in the production of food in terms of the global community? And he's concerned about, these multinational corporations that come in. The small family-owned business gets trampled. And it's not just a business being trampled, it's the human dignity and the contributions that people are making to the larger good. And these forces are unrelenting in the world right now. And so much of that is driven by the human person. And so we need to examine that. What I want to do is I have some questions that, there's things that I may have said that have stirred some comments on your part. And the one thing that the Pope pleads for in this encyclical is dialogue. That's his big thing, is dialogue. So this is what the kind of conversations he's hoping will just continue to happen. And it's just, again, amazing about the Pope. I mean, Harvard, Fordham, Yale, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, there just has not been a Catholic document that has been received with this public attention across religious boundaries. These are just some questions based on the first 3 chapters. We'll talk for about 10 minutes and then maybe get a feel for the room as to what some of the reactions were. Okay? His history is unbelievable. How he faced any number of things that would have ended a career. He just kept moving to new chapters. But you really get a feel for his life and some of the things he has faced. The other, the Harvard Review of Catholic Publications is a magazine called America. It's produced by the Jesuits, and we have a very famous person who is contributing to the discussion on Laudato Si. Nancy's son, Dan, has written a review of the encyclical. He's a major contributor in the world of environmental theology, environmental ecology, and quite a affirmation of his national reputation that he was asked to contribute in the magazine. So it's a brief reflection, but it can lead you to a lot of his articles and the book that recently he had published on the environment. And also, the National Catholic Reporter has a reader's guide to Laudato Si. It's got a lot of great questions. It's kind of designed if you had a group that wanted to study the encyclical in more detail. I also, Father Patty's book club is focusing in on this encyclical. It would be a great opportunity if you want to study in more depth the encyclical. Any reactions to those questions or even things that we talked about in the first?
I think we just discussed that we all have been inflicted by, or seen the harm, but also that you feel so helpless sometimes
Yes.
to be able to do anything about it.
Yeah, some of these things are these global forces. But as we get further in the encyclical, one of the great things about this encyclical are some of the recommendations the Pope makes. But when you hear this, that's how the feeling I had when I read that first chapter was, it's hopeless. What are we going to do about all of these things? Yes, John?
I think in answer to question 2, our initial reaction was that we don't really see a lot of pollution around us in our area, but then as we started giving it more thought, we thought about the air and particularly folks with asthma. We thought about the Chicago River, which one wouldn't say is necessarily the cleanest thing.
Yes, yeah.
Shannon brought up about the farmers and the nitrogen runoff into the rivers and what that brings in terms of algae development and so forth. If you think about it, there is a lot more that does impact us than
right. Very much so.
We talked about some of those cities that you mentioned, that if you go as a tourist, Pat's been to China, I've been to Cairo, that they only show you the good part.
Yes, right.
And only if you're looking way from the tourist bus do you see how they really live.
Yeah,
That's not true in India. India, it's all over.
Yeah.
You can't get away from it. Piles of garbage and piles of tires.
Everywhere, yeah. But I have been on those tours where you would think you were in, in heaven, right? That's about.
Maybe it's just taking a greater perspective. I know you were just in the Northwest or in Yakima. Coming out of the Northwest is a story that about half the salmon in the Columbia River system are estimated to die this year because of the heating of the Columbia River as a result of the reduced snowpack, reduced rainfall, and the heating of the river. And 76 is or 74 is about the maximum temperature for the salmon to survive, and the river is rising above that. So of the 500,000 salmon that are supposed to go through the river each, about half are estimated to die.
Wow. That's a very, they also just talk about, the harvesting of the oceans where, these big nets, and then most of what they collect is they just throw out, and that's where these species are getting.
I'm going to the third one, the implications of thinking the earth is our common home. In thinking about this, we must take personal responsibility and teach it. And now the parable of this is, I took my young grandson to the movie yesterday, and it came to getting the popcorn. I only had him. He said, "Oh, Grandma, I want a medium or large." I said, "I think not." How hard it was for me to say, "I think not."
Yes. Yeah.
In part, frankly, I didn't want to appear cheap.
Yeah.
So I said, I look at, and I restrained myself. The parable goes on. I restrained myself. I got the smallest bag possible for $5.75. That's the other part of me. And I made myself not take one bite. And he said, "I don't want the rest."
Oh. Yeah. That is the parable of what we're in right now. Yeah. I mean, it's how much is wasted. Yeah. Yes.
I'm disappointed that the people who are running the Olympics for next year in Rio de Janeiro, I've been hearing on the news that somebody finally is testing the water where the swimmers are going to swim, and it's got human waste in it. Sewage. And why didn't they check that out earlier?
When they awarded it to
I suspect there's a lot of things in Rio that they didn't check out, That's true. I mean, you would think of, that would be a very basic,
Very basic.
Yeah.
I was thinking, we're talking right now nationally, because I'm here in the States. But how much money have we given to other countries to help them? And your political class, your dictators, misuse the money, take it, and it's not being used for what it was sent for.
When the Pope speaks, one of the Pope's things is just the horrid scandal of corruption, particularly in developing world where, millions of dollars never get to the people or the projects. And he'll be addressing this in a little bit in this letter. The next 3 chapters are very important in the overall picture of what this encyclical is saying. Chapter 4 is called Integral Ecology. Now, this is the one chapter that nobody's reading that is why people kind of jump to certain conclusions about the encyclical. And like they talk and say, well, the encyclical is all about the environment. Well, it's much broader than just the physical environment. It's also very much about the human environment. And so this is the kind of the heart of the Pope's encyclical is in this chapter. And he presents this position he has on integral ecology. And by that he means that everything is connected. Nothing is in isolation. We constantly do a duality, the world of nature, the human person. And he's saying it's not two separate entities, it's one complex reality. And that we're not going to get anywhere ultimately if we don't see this interconnectedness from the smallest cell to large, vast ecosystems in the world that we live in. And he spends a lot of time on human ecology, this precious reality of the human person and the assault on the human person by economic systems, by political systems, the hundreds of thousands of people that, probably millions of people, that are really slaves, for no other better word. They have little or no control over their life. They live in conditions that can't even imagine. He talks about this relentless profit motive. Now, people, kind of constantly jump to the conclusion that he's bashing capitalism, but he's talking about the economic order, and there's more than enough guilt to pass around at every table when it comes to the implications of a relentless profit-driven economy that has no regard for the people or the resources of the world. And, he just said there's just an ongoing litany of these total disregard for systems, resources, and people. Again, this is where the sense of indifference comes out. The bottom line is the bottom line, and nothing can get in the way of the bottom line, no matter the fact that the over-harvesting of the seas is going to mean that the fishing industry may be, non-existent for wild fish in a rather close proximity to time. He talks about a new paradigm of justice that sees everything in creation having rights. And there's this long-held principle in Catholic theology of the common good. We have completely lost the sense of a common good. And he's not talking about the common good just, in Glenview or the state of Illinois or the United States. He's talking about the common good of the world. We have to start making decisions that are sensitive to everybody and not just a particular class of people or a particular nation. He challenges this opening up of our consciousness of the relationship of environmental ecology with human ecology, and that the stronger the environmental ecology is, the better the well-being of the human person. And the better the human person is, the better the environmental ecology. Looking at all of this as a connected reality. And this, again, is very difficult for our structures to understand or appreciate, because we all go to our corners, and he's talking, about very influential economic forces that go unchallenged and result in such human misery and suffering. It's the kind of not looking at what's happening. So this Columbia River situation is, that's the alarms are running. I mean, that's just an example, one example. You look at the economy of the Pacific Northwest if the salmon industry, was to be devastated. When I was in the state of Washington at a migrant camp, that was a whole other eye-opening experience for me. You know, it had all the feeling of being in an internment camp, in the sense that these buses come up with people from mostly Mexico, many of them undocumented, 7 days a week. They live, you know, families living in shacks. You know, for me, you know, I'm just one of these people. I'm guilty. I never think of where anything comes from. You know, go to Heinen's or the Jewel or Mariano's. You look at these beautiful displays of vegetables and fruit. Well, how did that get here? You know, and the biggest industry in the state of Washington are the orchards. You know, we talk about Microsoft, talk about Boeing. They don't compare to the agricultural economy in that state. And then when people sometimes say, well, you know, these people should all be shipped back to Mexico, who is going to do all this, you know? Or do we want to pay, you know, $18 for a tomato? I don't know. It's a complicated economic equation. And the equation requires us to be in conversation, and we're not having that kind of conversation. A husband and wife, migrant family can work full-time, you know, 7 days a week, and their annual income is about $14,000. And that's back-breaking. There are no benefits. You know, people get sick. Someone works overtime trying to send their kid to school, and then they don't get paid, but they can't challenge the employer because they're undocumented. It's just one terrible thing after another. And the Pope talks about, again, the pressures of urban life, the stress that people are under, the enormous issues, economic, that we're not talking about as a society. And so he pleads for this sense of awareness of the integrated ecology, that we're all connected, and that thread is very fragile. And then chapter 5 is entitled The Lines of Approach and Action. I mentioned before the break that one of the major moral imperatives of the encyclical is the call for dialogue. And the Pope believes, is very disappointed in all these world summits and international conferences on the environment. He said they've just basically been worthless. You know, everybody gets up on their soapbox. None of the actions are ever implemented. No one has the political will to implement any of these things. And until there can be conferences in which, you know, the powers to be begin looking at the world as ours, or we, not mine, we're not going to get very far. And so he pleads for dialogue on the international level, the national level, and the local level. Honest dialogue. People are very afraid when these conversations come up about the threats to our own quality of life, our own standard of living. He comes back to certain things, you know, less is more. How do we talk about materialism and consumerism that drives so much poverty in the world? What can we do to face the economic implications of just wages in the developing world? How do we allow people who up at this point have not been included in the economic engine? They've been providing the engine, but they're not benefiting from it. How can the human community enter more substantial and significant dialogue? He's very concerned about, you know, unilateral actions that countries make or companies make with no regard for how that is experienced by people on other levels. And the time is desperate. He keeps saying this is urgent. You know, we're in critical condition. We don't have 100 years to figure this out. We have to wake up. People have to start talking tomorrow or a week from now. There's a major summit on the environment taking place in Madrid, and that's one of the reasons. One of the things to get this, he wanted this letter out before the this conference takes place in hopes that it might have some impact on that. You can be sure that he will address the United Nations on this particular topic, that here you've got all the nations of the world. What more do we need to do? We're all suffering as our environment, both human and natural, is under such a siege. Then the final chapter is on ecological education and spirituality. And here is where he gets very practical. Again, very unusual for an encyclical to be as practical as this one is. But it begins with the call to ecological conversion, that we all have to convert. We all have to seek repentance for participations we have either explicitly or implicitly in the threats to the planet. We have to be honest about our own use of the resources, the earth, and the things that God has blessed us with. And he speaks of just some very important things. Like what struck me is, what do you think he thinks is like one of the most important things we could do right now to become an ecologically aware person? Well, the first thing he suggests is never get around a table for a meal without saying grace. That moment of prayer, of thanking God for this food and for those who brought it to this table, all of a sudden connects us with this larger, mysterious, profound connection with the world. You don't need to get a degree in environmental science. You don't have to protest this, that, or the other thing. You can pray. That grace in itself is such an important thing that we often take for granted. One of the things he talks about is the role parents have in creating in their homes a sensitivity to the environment and its world. Kids are watching all the time. They see how you use things, where your priorities are. How do you react to the world we're living in? How do they hear you talking about the environment, about the sacredness of creation? What are some of the things a family can do to create a ecologically sensitive household? This is where these kids get formed. Now, one of the interesting things, there's all this talk about the millennials, and that would be another lecture for another day. But many of the millennials I meet are very environmentally sensitive. They get appalled at some of the disregard or the waste that they see around. People are getting so paper aversive, They don't like getting paper, We're noticing, like with the bulletin, there are people, you're passing out bulletins, it's like you're giving them kryptonite. They will look at the bulletin online, but it's just this thing about paper. Now, I know Loyola Academy, St. Ignatius have gone to paperless environments where everything's on the laptop. They don't get books anymore, Everything is on this laptop. I'm a book person, so I'll never make that transition. But it's an awareness of the gift of the earth and of resources that the Lord has blessed us with. He calls us to a better commitment, deeper commitment to recycling, of trying to stem the tide of such reckless waste and waste that will never degrade, that's all over the place, and how that can make a big change. It's a jibe here to pastors. How many times do you leave the lights on? Just the simple conscious act of turning lights off. Will that change the economic order? No. But does it say to me, why am I wasting this? This is crazy. He challenges the continued development of clean energy, trying to diminish our dependence on fossil fuels and realizing that has a whole consequence in the life patterns of many people. He asks us to look at water consumption. Again, we just take water so for granted? And how can we open our hearts to an awareness of those whose very livelihoods are jeopardized? He cautions us about the violence that plagues the world, where human life is so disregarded. And we know in the city of Chicago, you read every day, 3 people shot here, 2 people shot there. It's a culture of violence, and what drives poverty and substance abuse and those kinds of challenges to the quality of life. He kind of closes with returning to the inspiration of this encyclical of St. Francis of Assisi, the apostle to the environment, he calls him. And that at the heart of Francis's teaching was this connection, the connectedness of the world that we live in, this beautiful, beautiful place. And while the Pope, makes many references in the encyclical to some pretty challenging things, in the end, he's very hopeful. He really believes that the more people enter dialogue, the more we get informed, the more open we are to people's experiences in the periphery and the margins, whatever that might be in our world, he thinks hearts will be changed. He believes that conversion is possible. He believes that we can reverse some of these forces that threaten the viability of our planet. He's very confident that this can happen, but it's going to call for ecological conversion. It's going to call for a change of heart. It's going to call for more honest and transparent conversations. It's going to mean having to leave some of our comfort zones about what we feel about things in order to enter into the dialogue that is vital and real with other people. I just want to have us briefly enter one more conversation on these last 3 chapters, and then we'll conclude with some final questions and remarks. This will be about a 10-minute conversation at the tables. There you go.
You do it all right.
Thanks.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Oh, she's got it. Okay.
I just mean,
There you go. Go, Lee. Anything to do with an encyclical before? That's Frank.
And, you mentioned that the Pope talks about, increasing the dialogue, which I think is critical. I think you gave a good example when you talked about you went and you visited the migrant workers and how they live and how terrible it is, and we all, whether we see it in person or we read about it or we see it on TV, it's terrible. But then the dialogue ends by the next thing which you stated, do you want to pay $18 for the tomato?
Right,
And then it ends.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't end there, because that's easy. Then we all say, yeah, that's right, we can't afford $18 tomatoes, so that's too bad.
Right.
Keep going, keep talking about it, let's figure it out.
Yeah, he really is passionate about the process of dialogue, and that it has to be, what you're speaking of, it has to keep going. It's one of his frustrations with those international world summits is that they're not connecting with any change, Yes.
but you learn in education that what you do is you pick the main point, the international conference, and then you go back and you start with little steps.
Yeah.
And you try not to get too discouraged when the little steps fail, but you just keep trying and trying, and if you don't do that, nobody's going to come in and change that.
Right. It's a process.
It'll
Yeah.
undermine you. So
Yeah.
I think we should keep ourselves so isolated, but rather do what you did, like visit a migrant. Visit here, there, everywhere.
Yeah.
Take opportunities to see and experience some of this. Because we ourselves are way too isolated.
And like when you talk about traveling, sometimes challenging the places that you're going to say, well, I want more of a feel of what it's really like here. Yeah. Yes.
I think something that Mary Beth said is really important, that if you're talking to your grandkids about, or if they're questioning something that they're used to because that's what they grew up with, you can explain that it hasn't always been like that, and to just give them some background, and they'll, maybe think differently.
Yeah, he really thinks the domestic church, the home, is so influential in this. To never, as a grandparent or a parent, underestimate, how you influence your children and how they see the world or the values that you're trying to shape them in. That's such a strong element of this encyclical, is this driving consumerism that we never have enough. We just have to keep going. Yeah.
And then what happens is, because I still have, the 2 kids in college and a 17-year-old, is that's the concept that the parents are teaching the children. And so then you've got, I want this mom, I want this dad, I want, they got to have all the iPads, they got to have all the computers, they got to have all the new technology. That's where it starts, is in the heart of the family and morals and values that the parents are giving to their children.
Yes, very much so.
Sue and I just drove a northerly and a southerly route between Chicago and Denver. So northerly we went through Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, Wyoming, down to Denver, and returning we drove through Nebraska, Iowa, etc. Endless coal trains, filled as far as the eye can go. One image. The other image is endless windmills. Okay. So we have two images of U.S. power production future. What can we do to act globally, think globally, act locally in terms of that image? And the Pope is calling in the encyclical for reduction on fossil fuels. What do we do to eliminate those coal trains? And how can we start here in Glenview?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, if you go out to Arizona, you can see, as far as the eye can see, solar panel arrays out in the desert, which is a wonderful use for a land that can't be used for anything else. So you see it in Spain, it is hopeful.
Spain, yeah. Now, Sister Pauline is trying to give us a sense of global warming. I don't know about you, but it's getting awfully warm in here. But I just wanted, just in conclusion, just some takeaways of this letter. And again, I thank all of you for being here and for your thoughtful participation. I think one of the things the Pope really hopes that will transform hearts is this notion of integral ecology, that we begin never taking for granted the connectedness of all of creation. The Pope feels very strongly, as you can tell from this letter, that we are in a crisis that demands action. He pleads with those in leadership positions and for teachers and for parents to seize this crisis and to begin the process of education and changing habits and behaviors. The heart of this encyclical is the call to dialogue, that we take advantage of opportunities to listen to the experience of others. We have to begin to prioritize people over profits, the planet over profits. This is a challenging equation in the economic order, and the Pope sees this as a real opportunity for ecumenical development. A lot of times we get in these religious discussions, it's all about what you believe, what I believe, what my church teaches, what your church teaches. I don't go to church, I don't believe any. When it comes to the planet, our livelihood, our future, we all have a stake in it. And this can be one of the ways of bringing a fractured world together. And I would now like to invite Pat Connery to come forward to lead us in our closing prayers, unless anyone has one last comment they want to share. Oh, thank you. Thank
you. This is a prayer entitled "In Celebration of Earth Day" by Sister Joan Chichester, who is one of my spiritual mentors. We are co-creators with God of what creation has left unfinished. What has been left in embryo is left for us to develop. What can be developed, God trusts us to bring to full potential. Co-creation, the human commandment to continue the work of God on earth,
requires us to tend the land and conserve the waters, to till the garden and protect the animals, to use the things of the earth in ways that enhance all life now and preserve them for later generations. To do that, we must become part of the liturgy of life. Love that phrase, the liturgy of life. Treating as holy everything we touch, regarding as sacred every being alive, intent on preserving the best of what is, while we use our science and technology to protect, defend, and enhance them all. Amen.